Howdy, folks. It is January Monday. I'm going to do that again. Howdy, folks. It is Monday, January 30th, 2012. I'm Skip Ruddertail, your otter editor, and with me, as well never before, is
Sorin, the cat who's not Toonces.
Sorin the cat. We have an outro cat here, a fill-in, if you will, because I am in Colorado, and Sorin was good enough to invite us over for an excellent dinner. And more on that in a minute. But this is the Bad Dog Book Club, and this is episode 24B, believe it or not. So we have done, we've done doing this almost a year now. We're getting pretty close there. So it's kind of neat. This is my first time getting to host with a guest. Toonces has got to do this once before with Sparf last time I was on a trip, so this is kind of fun. We get to do a little turnabout, and even better, we're discussing one of Toonces' stories. So thanks for doing this, man.
Well, thank you for having me and visiting and all that kind of stuff. It's been great.
I should point out we're very professional here. Unlike normally when we record the book club, we actually have a table to use that the microphone is on, and we have actual chairs instead of my couch and coffee table, or Toonces' bed and a overturned milk crate. So this is very posh here, and I'm very impressed. This show's moving up in the world.
Well, we try to make things upscale, for various guests or podcasts that come over to visit us.
No. And it was an excellent dinner. You made chicken marsala and mushroom risotto.
My second risotto, but I think it turned out okay.
Very good. Yeah, I was impressed, and I was having Gordon Ramsay flashes there, but there was no screaming involved, and nobody was thrown out of the kitchen, so it was a win-win. Yeah. So this week's story is Straight Humiliation, Pulp, by Toonces, and which is a classic Toonces title if you follow his readings, and if you don't, I don't know why you'd listen to the podcast, but if you don't, you should. Classic Toonces title, and I think you had a thought about the.
I just found my first thought when I read the title was how humorous it was that Toonces likes to add the word pulp to his titles. Because going along with that naming convention, you would get such books as Gone with the Wind, the novel, and War and Peace, the epic novel. So I just thought that was a little humorous, but it definitely adds some style to the story, which is, as far as authors and writing goes, is definitely a good thing to add a little bit of uniqueness to your writing, even when you're writing pornography or erotica, as we like to refer to it, to make ourselves sound more professional.
They should add that to all books.
I agree.
And then, so you could have, or movies, so you could have Ballistic, X for Sever, The Waste of Time, that kind of thing. It'd be great. It would simplify life.
You definitely know, if this was going to be worth it or not. Mm-hmm. The problem that you run into, though, is that they couldn't also look forward in time, so you would open like a 7-book series, and the first one wouldn't be, the first of 7, don't bother reading the other 6.
Right. Or what was that Fourth Wheel of Time book where it's like, nothing happens in this book except in the first page and the last page. You could skip the rest. Move on.
But you could put that in the title, so it could be the Fourth Wheel of Time. Read the first and last page, and then you're done.
There you go. It would simplify life some. Might sell a few less books, but they're trade-offs. Yeah. So this is I'm really excited. I love reading Toonces stuff. I have, it's always fun working with them, and the thing that always stands out in my mind about Toonces stories, leaving aside the obvious fact that they're usually pretty hot, I love how wordy they are, and I think part of that is because I tend to write, and I haven't written a lot of fiction, but at least when I'm writing in anything, or nonfiction realms, I tend to write in a very concise prose style. I'm very direct, and I really work to simplify when I'm writing. And so I love how he just plays with the words, and he plays with the sound of words, how they roll, how they fit together on the page. If you were reading them out loud, how you would say them together, and how they'd sound together. And that's one of the things I always love about his writing. He just you can tell he just enjoys fitting the words together and crafting the sentence. And I think that always shows through stuff.
Having not read nearly as many of Toonces' pieces as Skip, but definitely enjoying this one. there is a lot of really fabulous wordplay in it, in my experience. There's a lot of word crafting and a lot of really interesting usage of a lot of prose that nonetheless really kind of brings out the story and kind of shapes it into a lot of interesting imagery and a lot of interesting metaphor.
Well, even right at the beginning of the story, the second paragraph, the line where the woman on the phone says to Biscuit, "They're as good as the commodity futures. You want a Wistar, any Wister will do, and any Wistar will do it." It sounded like she said that plenty of times before. And he goes, "Yeah, they say that." And just the idea, I think there's this kind of playfulness, and just the idea that nobody would ever say anything like that. Or it's a very weird thing to say, but it sounds interesting, and you go back and you read it again because it's funny and odd, and I just like the idea of saying like, "Oh yeah, they say that." I think it's a good example.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you can even look at that sentence where the descriptive is that he averred, which I have almost never read I love the word. I love how it rolls off the tongue, but I have almost never used it as an alternative to said, which is always a challenge in writing, is trying to find ways to say he said without saying he said, because it gets really old when you read it a lot.
She hung up with the curt but polite salutation of a person who has more important things to attend to.
Very descriptive.
Yeah.
Like you get the effect immediately without having to beat someone over the head with it, which I think is really nice.
The word choices reinforce the personalities of the characters. And not just the word choices that the characters themselves are uttering, but I think the word choices that are being used to describe the characters or their actions, which is very hard to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, you get a distinct impression of the woman on the phone's personality, even though she appears in the story for maybe 5 or 6 sentences out of the entire story. You really get an impression and a kind of an impact of the type of personality that she has.
Yeah, it's sort of a sort of, precise, efficient, maybe doesn't really care, but she's getting the business done, and she'll be as pleasant as she needs to, and not rude, but nothing more than that either. And I think the word choices reflect that. Getting to the overall story, I did want to say a quick thing, and this is interesting because Sparf read for us this week.
And did a fabulous job.
He's so good. He's so good. We'll definitely have to keep taking advantage of him. I mean that. But yes, he read for us. It was great. But he said to me, this story is a little difficult to read because he was a little uncomfortable in regards to the subject matter. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't know, the whole humiliation thing and humiliating the straight guy, that was a little tough for me. And that was interesting to me, and I could see how it is. And we'd just been talking a couple episodes ago about the boundaries that we have as readers, or in this case, actually reading and presenting when we read stories. In saying that cuckolding was something that Toonces is uncomfortable with in regards to our last story. So it was kind of interesting, I think, that we went from one uncomfortable area one week to another one for a core person involved in the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, especially poignant since you went from a story that Toonces expressed being uncomfortable about to a story that he wrote that the reader was uncomfortable with, and I think that's really, really kind of interesting when you look at those boundaries and just the kind of the boundaries that people set often without really realizing them until they're confronted with them.
And it's interesting because often what one person finds uncomfortable is exactly what the other person finds arousing, and for the same reasons, I think, in many levels. And this is a story, and this also goes back to our discussion a couple weeks ago about doing stories for commissions, or stories with doing stories as a favor to somebody, or doing stories with specific furs in mind. And Biscuit obviously is a specific fur, and he's Biscuits on FA. So it's a specific character, a friend of Toonces, who stars in this story. And he requested this story. He requested some of the parameters of this story and loves it, and actually said to Toonces, sure, you can use it for the podcast. and so if we are reading this and saying, okay, Biscuits is a star, Biscuits likes this story, Biscuits said we can use it, we can probably infer, I think, that Biscuits finds this story arousing.
Well, and I can definitely see that. And again, it goes back to what you were saying about just the whole uncomfortableness being either what can turn someone off of or turn someone on to an idea. And I think that that's generally true. I think if you look at most of the more, I don't want to say outrageous, but more of the more extreme fetishes, I think you find often that it is the uncomfortableness that actually is the arousing thing. And there's just a difference with people about what discomfort they find arousing or inviting and what discomfort they don't like.
Well, and of course, sparse discomfort, as he said to me, was in terms of being concerned for the humiliated party. You know, that's what upset him about reading this story, was that he felt bad for Biscuit in this situation. And we also know that, you know, the persona Biscuit thinks this is a hot situation to be in. So it's an interesting thing. And it goes into these categories of the taboo and a little bit, I think, in the two terms of the, you know, liminal and these in-between states that are powerful and they're arousing because they're powerful and they're dangerous because they're powerful. And how do you read that, and the danger and arousal and the conflation therein, I think, is why these stories have the power they do.
Yeah, I mean, and if you get more deeply into it, I think that it even goes into the whole concept of why a lot of people find fetishes distasteful, because it is a lot about enjoyment or, you know, arousal from the discomfort of the subject matter, and just kind of coming to grips with that, I think, is more difficult for some people than it is for others. So, yeah, I mean, one thing that I did notice that I thought was really interesting is that the title of the story really sets up the piece to be a humiliation story, which it is, and you totally get that. It was very well crafted, and there was a lot of prose and setup for that. But at the same time, I found it very interesting that the concept was more specifically on the idea of straight humiliation, and reading the story, I didn't get that until about halfway through, that there was any sort of sexual orientation implied for Biscuit one way or the other, and not really being familiar with the character. It wasn't until they started specifically, the lion and the panther started specifically making an issue of his perceived sexual orientation that I realized that there was not only more of a play on words in the title, but also that Biscuit's sexual orientation was straight, and that this was another aspect of the story and of the humiliation that was happening. Because I could see that this whole story playing out almost the same, literally with just a more conservative gay character kind of being humiliated and pushed into a situation beyond his limits without any of the sexual orientation aspects coming to play in it.
Well, that's actually a really interesting point, and that's something that hadn't occurred to me until you brought that up, is that when you read this, you didn't perceive Biscuits necessarily as straight until you're informed of such a good way into the story. And you know, is this an omission on Toonces' part? Not that that would ever happen, of course, buddy. But is this an omission on Toonces' part, or you know, we do have, I think, a cultural construction that people are assumed to be straight until proven otherwise.
Which I think is something...
And is that part of that is, I think it partially, you know, obviously like anything, it depends on the audience reading it. And we're gay guys sitting down reading this. And so maybe, and we also know Toonces, and we also know the kinds of stories he usually writes. So maybe we can be forgiven in this case for just assuming this character is going to be gay. And I think maybe there is a little, that could be something that could have been straightened, or, you know, how do we present Biscuits as straight without explicitly saying as such?
Yeah, and I almost think that in this case, it's it really is something that has to be taken into account. When you look at mainstream TV, mainstream TV portrays straight characters as normal. And when mainstream TV wants to express this character as gay, they're usually over the top and flamboyant. And I think that, like you said, is kind of an expression of the culture, but at the same time, writing in the furry fandom and writing for furros, which while, I will completely admit there is a wide diversity of sexual orientations, the fandom started out and still is a majority gay. And I think that most people will agree that there is a majority of that and bi persuasion. And when you're writing to that audience, it's more important to actually define the norm, or the anti-norm as being straight, as opposed to like mainstream TV and mainstream literature where it's assumed and gay is the one that you have to express a little stronger if that's the point you want to get across.
So this line, I think you're right, and I think that's something that Toonces could do maybe better in this story. But it raises this other line in me, thinking about the later part of the story. What if we reframe it a little bit as sort of a reverse or an outing story in fears of being outed? And what if we look at the story in that kind of framework, saying that as, growing up as, or at one point as a gay kid, before you were out, there's this fear that you're going to be exposed, and everybody's going to know. And what if we look at this story in that kind of context?
Well, and I think in that kind of context, that's, I think, initially my impression of the story. When I the first time that I read the story through, just to kind of get a general idea, that was more the impression I got than a story where the character starts straight and ends straight and was humiliated by basically a forced sexual encounter and realizing that he liked it and questioning his sexuality. As I really did get an impression more that it was a character that was undecided about their sexual orientation and was exposed to something that they liked, until I kind of read it the second time with more depth and really kind of got a lot of the nuance of the language and really kind of got that impression from it that, no, this is a character that has up until now decided that he was straight and has labeled himself with that sexual orientation, and then is being put into a situation where he either maybe questions it or at least wonders about whether he enjoys the situation that he's in.
Well, and I think there's that right at the end, I made note of this line, right at the end when they're saying, they've had their way with biscuits, as it were, and, they're sending him on his way. He thanks them, which I found interesting, and in a demeaning sort of way. And then, they say, well, you have to come back to get the money. And it says $5,000 the panther cut in. He arched his eyebrows and tried to share a smile with the rat that said, I know. The rat asked politely for his clothes and what hours they would be available tomorrow. And the I know is italicized. And I think what the panther knows is going on multiple levels here, if we read the story in this light. So that he knows that, Biscuit is going to come back to get that money. And of course, and he knows that he's going to do Biscuit again.
And more to the fact that Biscuit knows that he's going to be back.
Right.
Regardless of his
even
his
if
views.
Biscuit isn't sure what he is, this guy knows what Biscuit is, I think. There's just a menace in that line, which works very well in the story.
Which I thought was really interesting, actually. When you look at the characters, the subtleties in their personality, I think, is something that I was really impressed with Toonces' characters. Like, you look at Maximilian, and there really is you immediately get the sort of the jock personality, but with a very subtle kind of menace to him. And I think reading through the story and the way he behaves, you definitely get that that's what Toonces was going for, and that's totally like apparent in the character when you first meet him.
Yeah. Well, and you've got very distinct. I mean, they treat him in different ways at various times. You know, the lion steps in and says, "You can't bully him like that, or he won't come back." So they're, you know, they're. I think, especially in short porn stories, which this is, you know, it's very easy to slip into very broad, kind of stereotypical characters, you know, who play things out a certain exact predictable way.
Well, and I think that that's one of the signs of both good short stories and good erotica, you know, coming from both sides is whether you let your characters slip into the stereotypical or not. And, you know, granted, I'm sure all of us have been at one time or another on the lookout for a story about a stereotypical character, but we're certainly not looking for that for any sort of depth. You know, we're looking for something for a quick read, you know, and that's completely different than what you get with more developed characters and more interesting personalities. Is if they don't fit a stereotype, you're more drawn into, and in my opinion, it actually makes a better story, and even from the sense of erotica, it makes a hotter story to have characters that you have to think about as well as looking at them in the sexual context of the story.
And this is, it's such a story. I guess one of the things that strikes me too is, on one level, the story is very much, here are things that get done to Biscuit. On the other level, you know, and I think the better reading, you know, and how it's written too, is here are things that Biscuit gets done to him, in shifting the agency, as it were, here, where we have, you know, story is all about Biscuit, and, you know, he gets guided into thing after thing, and I get the feeling that at any point, or, you know, in this, he could have put a stop to this in a lot of ways, and he chooses not to, and he doesn't know why he chooses not to, and I think that's one of the best things about how it's written, is that there is conflict and confusion in our protagonist's mind all throughout the story.
Yeah, there really is a sense of when you're reading it, is both you and Biscuit are going along for the ride. Mm-hmm. That there really is an out of control element, both as the reader and as Biscuit, even though he is the main character, which typically denotes at least some sense of control of how the story goes. You always get a feeling in a lot of writing that the main character has a grasp of control on the story. Whether or not they choose or can exert that control, there's always a feeling that the main character is setting the pacing and setting the story, and you really don't get that in this story.
Well, and it ends, of course, I mean, the sex scene ends with Biscuit coming. And if we don't want to, I don't want to get too Freudian here, but, you know, it ends with Biscuit coming and an involuntary reaction in some ways to the situation, you know, and as we know from all high school biology, it's partially voluntary, but, you know, when you get to that precipice, it's involuntary, and he's no longer in control of his own body.
Both
as the situation runs away with him. And that is, you know, in some ways that's the scariest thing in this story. And that moment, I think, summarizes the whole story, is, you know, Biscuit comes and it's this great, amazing event, and it's completely beyond his control and terrifying because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was definitely a very good use of that loss of control, and specifically that loss of sexual control, that loss of your own body, which I think deep down everyone has, whether or not you have fetishes based on that loss of control. Either what makes it exciting or what makes it terrifying is that thought of that loss of control, of kind of the one aspect that, especially in our culture, we keep to ourselves. Yeah. and the loss of that was very masterfully crafted in this story. I think that you get that feeling of that loss, and at the same time the confusion at Biscuit's enjoyment of that loss.
And I gotta say, on a personal level, that's probably my favorite thing in erotic stories is a loss of control. And it doesn't have to be in this sort of way. I think there are other ways you can present a loss of control in erotic stories, but that's probably, in a general term, without getting into specific, that's what does it for me.
And I think that
may say a lot about my personality. So, I like being in control. I like being in charge and controlling things. And so that's something that the loss of that is arousing to me.
Although at the same time, I could argue that I think the draw of erotica in general is loss of control. Mm. Because if you think about it, the general draw that I would say that pull most people to pornography and to erotica in general is that escape from their typical lives where they have to be in control to either read or immerse themselves in a fiction where they can be primal and they can lose that need to be proper and that need to be in control and the need to be sophisticated and interact in our world and can just lose themselves.
Sounds
in
like
the passion.
Part of the appeal of being a furry too.
I agree.
We might see the connection between furry and sexuality.
Well, I think that there's a lot of connection on many levels between furry and sexuality, and I don't think that that's a negative thing. I think most subcultures, when you get right down to them, are a specific group's attempt to come to grasp with finding that ability to let themselves go and to release themselves from the constraints of an otherwise pretty controlling world and a pretty controlling society.
Well, and it may hold, you and I, we come from a Judeo-Christian Western cultural background, which is very built around a separation of the mind and the body and the culture and the not. And the not would be sexuality. And so we come particularly from a background that emphasizes a distance between the two and a uncleanliness, and a distaste for the body and eroticism and losing control, which I think also adds to the taboo and arousing nature of it.
On a side note, with the discussion of like control and the loss of control, one thing I did find very interesting was how even in the story the two, I guess you could say antagonists. They're not really, but in the context of the story, they're the antagonists. Where even between them, we're fighting for control of the situation.
Yes.
with very different personalities. Maximilian tries to be very dominant and very, I know what you want and you want me and that's my control. And then you have the photographer who's very
Mr.
Menino who is very controlling more and is trying to appeal to everyone and just coax a little bit more out of them. And it's interestingly a very photographer way of doing things.
It feels like a director too, like a film director, working with stars, trying to get the right performance, guide his stars gently to get the right performance.
Just trying to coax that perfect photo out. And
he's already casted. He has the dominant, toffee panther here, Maximilian, and he has the guy who's gonna be the submissive Twinkie guy, and he's already made his casting. He already knows the performance he wants, and I think he just gives little nudges here and there to push them, each of them, that extra distance, to make them do the thing they were already leaning towards, and he'll just give them that little extra bump.
Yeah, and kind of get in the middle of it as well, which is always fun.
Right.
One thing that I did find really interesting, kind of going back to the whole gender stereotypes and sexual orientation. One thing that I found really interesting and is kind of glazed over really nicely in the story is the whole scene where they're doing the shoot with the football and Biscuit, who's the straight guy, has no clue what to do with this thing, and it is the gay jock that is literally coaching him on how to properly hold the football.
Yes,
and
I like that.
I thought that was really kind of interesting, and really was a good way to kind of upset the gender and the sociosexual stereotypes without doing it blatantly. And I thought that was really interesting.
Well, and I think it's, especially in this case too, it's Biscuit's humiliation again, that these gay guys are in some ways better guys than he is, even though he's straight.
Yeah,
because they have the other guy tropes, that they're the other weird cultural baggage we attach to male and female roles in this society.
They're buff, they're macho, they know football, they are very confident and sure of themselves, which are all tropes that our culture associates with being a man. And
yet we also, as culturally, associate being gay with being a woman. And so we get this nice kind of conflation, as you said, mixing them up in an interesting way here. I did want to talk a little bit about, so I think the story's working pretty well. We had a couple things we wanted to say about just setting up Biscuit for this particular audience, maybe, as a writer. We did, discuss one of your stories a couple weeks ago, and I just wanted to, say, I think I said at the time, I was like, I hope we weren't too rough on you. But what you told me, you said you had some news about movie nights.
So after listening to the episode on movie night, I found myself nodding through most of your and Toonces' discussion about the story. It was one of my early ones. And finding that I agreed and realizing that there was a lot more of a story to tell. And so it's kind of exploded into its own monster, and has grown to over 8,000 words right now, and is looking at pushing itself on towards a novella, which I find kind of interesting, from a short story that I wrote because basically I really wanted to write about foxes fucking, and from that kind of turning itself into taking into a lot of the concepts that you guys discussed about, like, wanting to, more about Avery's ex, and wanting to understand more of the relationship, between him and Reed, and also Ian and Avery. And there's a lot of that has kind of grown almost by itself into a story on its own.
Which is awesome. And I look forward to seeing some drafts of this down the road. I'm excited. I did want to bring that up because not only is it awesome, but one of the things that Toonces is constantly telling folks is, we put a lot of stories on here that are like published or about to be published, but we also put a lot of stories that are more, works in progress, or they've released on an FA, but they want to do more things with it. And so I wanted to kind of say it doesn't need to be perfect, guys, to send it in, because we want to, there's lots to talk about, and hopefully I think we were fair and we didn't kill you or anything. So that was good, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I think that having a story that wasn't quite done almost spurred more interesting conversation than if it had been.
Sometimes that's definitely the case.
And if you're looking at something, especially for a discussion group like this book club, I think that that's important, because anyone can go out and buy a novel and discuss this, discuss the concepts in that novel, but it's kind of hard to, in my opinion, to discuss a story that's perfect. Not that there are many out there that are, even published ones. I mean, I don't think that's the case, but I think the more that there is, as long as it's accepted that stories are constantly evolving, there's a lot to learn from that as well, especially for newer authors like myself.
Yeah, so send them in, guys. We love to have them, and we love to have readers too. There was one other thing, just to shift again a little bit, because this is something that, thinking about is, Biscuit, says I'm straight, and I had, a couple readers say to me, and it was a thought I had myself too, which was, I don't know if Biscuit's straight. you think about it, and what do you think? I mean, is Biscuit straight?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of that goes really strictly to whether you are the type of person that likes to apply labels, or whether you are a person that looks more at actions. I think that if I had to kind of judge Biscuit, if I was in some sort of position,
And we're going to be clear here, Biscuit. We're discussing story Biscuit, not F.A. Biscuit.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is always one of these confusing things where somebody has like a character. This is when we were talking about the perils of writing commissions for people. This is one of those perils here. Is that like, okay, we are talking about the story character, not the real person or the real person's persona. So that's our disclaimer here.
Yeah,
but anyway, continue.
To emphasize on that,
Fag Biscuit. No, just kidding. Okay, continue.
Yeah, to emphasize on that, I don't know Biscuit. I haven't talked to him, and literally my first exposure was his story. So if I was to go just off of this story, and I was the type of person
written by gay Toonces.
Yeah. And I was the person to apply labels, I would probably say that I would not qualify him as straight. I don't know if I would qualify him as gay, because I think and I think that you agree that gay is more than just your desire to have sex with men.
Right.
It's a mindset, and it's also kind of a social decision that you make.
Right.
So I wouldn't label the story Biscuit as gay. I also would not label him as straight by pretty much any stretch of the imagination that I would have based on the way the story was constructed and the way the character acted in the story.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I think that's pretty much where I stand too. And I think this is, we talked a few minutes ago about how our society conflates certain cultural notions so that one thing equals another. And so we were saying that, masculinity equal, and a large figure equals masculinity equals love of sports equals macho, equals straight, and messing around with that conflation. And, another one of the conflations is that having sex with people of the same gender equals gay. And we kind of we like binary systems in Western culture. We like it's either one or the other. This is part of that. We like conflating things to kind of simplify how we think of them. And I think it's that kind of thinking that leads to all kinds of prejudices and misconceptions about people. So yeah, I think we might have a character here who is not gay because they aren't part of that cultural community. In the same way that I think I could say, maybe I collect, things of Disney's Robin Hood and love that, but if I'm not going to furry cons or know anything about the furry community, am I a furry? Or if I'm a fantasy writer writing with, like, cat people, or like a Skyrim, programmer with Khajiit who doesn't know anything. I'm sure they do, but pretending I didn't know anything about, fur affinity or any of that, are they furry then?
Yeah, I think that there is a big focus in our culture with pre-drawing those connections for people and equating association with acceptance or understanding. And I think that's a mistake, and I think that that's a mistake that our society generally makes, and that one of the signs of a more enlightened subculture is the ability to realize that association with something does not make you part of that thing, or an aspect of something does not make you part of that thing.
And then, of course, the flip side of that is that even part of that culture, there are degrees within there, and just because, you aren't, wearing a rainbow shirt everywhere you go, you can still be gay and part of the gay culture. So yeah, I think we got this very interesting character, Biscuit, who doesn't, says he's one thing, probably isn't, but may not know who he is yet, and may take time to figure it out. And that's kind of one of the also, I think, interesting things in this story is in a lot of ways, especially the way it ends, this story feels like the start of many other things.
Yeah, there's definitely less.
And I like that. A lot of times I like that in short stories that they kind of leave you with thinking about what's going to happen next. And it doesn't do it in a way that makes you feel unfulfilled or like you got gypped out of it. Like, man, I really got cheated to find out. We aren't left like that. Or it isn't like, oh, did he die or didn't he? One of those kinds of stories. But it leaves you with the expectation that this is the start of other interesting things for this character. Which I like.
Yeah, you definitely get the... I like how you get the impression that it's not so much about the character Biscuit thinking one thing and then realizing another. It's really more of an exploration of Biscuit wondering if he really understands himself as well as he does.
Yes, exactly. That's how I read it anyway. And maybe we're reading that because we have gone through this process. And if we were straight, we wouldn't read it like that at all. So that could be an interesting
but again,
point to raise.
You are writing to an audience.
Yes.
It was a request from a person who likes his character in straight humiliation stories to someone who very obviously and very blatantly writes gay pulp. So there is an aspect in that, I think, of writing to the audience and at least understanding the audience that this is probably going to translate and be read by.
Right. That's right. I don't know. Do you have... I think we're about wrapped up for today. I think we've covered most of our major points. It was fun getting to get into a Toonces story. And again, I say, buddy, I love just... And like I said, I always love the stories because, like I said before, I think that typically now, in general, people writing in a more economizing style, and that's the current prose style, and this kind of almost excessive wordiness, but excessive in a playful way, is a little bit of a throwback stylistically.
Yeah, I
don't see it a lot in furry porn, especially. Yeah. And I don't know, I like it. It's fun for me.
I agree. I do have to say playfully that there were a couple of times where I considered going to a dictionary.
Yeah.
And I consider myself pretty well versed and, generally a good grasp of more complicated words. So, bravo on that. But it wasn't...
look at this line here. There's an example. This is amazing. And so Biscuit continued to cough and gag on the rod until his throat became more supple to the encroachments. The guy is being face-fucked, and he turns the guy is being face-fucked into his throat became more supple to further encroachments. How fucking great is that?
Yeah, it makes you picture like a Victorian manuscript,
yes.
and at the same time, it's very obvious what's happening to Biscuit. But you could totally see like the almost exact same prose.
It's cocksucking with the pinky held extended. That's what it is here, folks.
So remember to extend your pinky when you read this story if you haven't yet. Yes. It will make the experience much better. Having tea and crumpets is also a good plus.
Yes. I've got to bring Toonces back some more tea because I brought him some of the Celestial Seasonings is right here in Boulder.
Right.
So last time he doesn't like coffee, but he likes the caffeine. So I brought him the Morning Thunder, the one with the bison on it, which is like super caffeinated tea. So I got to bring him back some more.
Have you ever gone on the tour?
It is cool.
The mint room?
It is cool. The mint room
peppermint
is awesome.
Room is...
You guys, okay, listeners, if you ever get to Boulder, Celestial Seasoning Tea Company, go on the factory tour, which is great.
It is great.
They have a mint room.
It's a vault that is floor to ceiling.
Rolling, like, hermetically sealed, sliding door, rolls open.
And it's full of the peppermint that they use in their most popular tea.
I think there's catnip in there.
Is there?
There is some,
I would
too.
believe it. On a side note, if they ever do the contest asking what their most popular tea is, it is their peppermint tea. You'll win a book. That's a side note if you're ever on the factory tour. But it's intense. It is
awesome. You walk in and your like sinuses clear in about 2 seconds. It's totally cool. So yes, that's a great factory tour. So I have to bring back some tea for Toonces. So next time you're writing a very refined pulp story, you can work that in. I think that's part of the appeal of the pulp too, because that itself is a past shout out to the yellow back pulp Victorian era in the 20s and 30s and the little dime novels. So except the gay guys didn't all die at the end of this one, so that's a little different from those older ones. But great fun, and thank you, Soren. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that was about it. Thank you for letting me join you and talk about it. It's been great.
Thank you. I think we've got a hot tub to go enjoy too.
I think we do.
I can't complain. But thank you, listeners, and thank you, Toonces, and thank you, Spark, for reading for us. We will be back next week with a news story, and in 2 weeks I'll be back in Maryland with Toonces. So we'll see you then. Ciao.
See ya.